We continue with our news review here with Senators Kimani Wamatangi and Mutula Kilonzo from Kiambu and Makueni counties respectively, and Karanja Kabagi, businessman and analyst. Well, of course, we are discussing the headlines emanating from the State of the Nation address 2017 made yesterday in Parliament by President Uhuru Kenyatta. Just before the break, we've discussed about corruption and the SRC report that the President mentioned in Parliament with regard to reduction in salaries of the next crop of elected leaders, that after August the 8th, and whether or not the pronouncements by the President effectively mean that that will happen. We do understand that it is still up to parliamentarians to approve that report. Now I want to look at another aspect because we're not able to handle everything that the President talked about. He had an 82-page speech, and it has a lot of things, but some of the highlights and what we are discussing are the highlights as captured on the headlines this morning. And on page 5 of the Daily Nation, it discusses debt, Kenya's borrowing, of course by the government, whether from domestic sources or other sources. And what the President says basically is that we are not at risk of debt default. That's our ability to repay back the debt. Head of State says all the loans taken have been for funding infrastructure, which will translate into economic gains over time. However, the World Bank had called for caution as Kenya's public debt had outstripped growth in revenue collection. Senator Mutula Kilonzo,
yes.
Let's start with you.
Yes.
Were you satisfied by the President's explanation that we are still able to pay the debt?
No, not as such. I sit in the Finance Committee of the Senate, and we have raised a red flag about this. And to his credit, the Governor of Central Bank at the time, and that was last year, gave us a graph of the borrowing, and we have exceeded our levels. But it's not the question of repayment in 2017. What most people don't know is that these debts, there is a moratorium on the borrowing for this particular debts, and they will kick in 2019. Most of them, including the borrowings in the Eurobond, the borrowings on the Standard Gauge Railway. The rubber will meet the road in 2019.
So we've not even started repaying some of these.
We have not even started. It has not even started.
So by the President saying that we are not at risk of default,
he's talking about what maybe the debts that they have been paying. We're talking about what they have borrowed for this infrastructure project that will kick in much later. So to his credit, the President is giving us a warning when he talks about a wage bill, because the question of repayment will not arise now. It will arise later. So therefore I was not satisfied about that, because what we should have done and what we should do on the national debt, I'm not even sure whether we have complied with the Constitution as such. We have an argument in the Finance Committee, for example. We have borrowed a sum of money from World Bank to do capacity at county level. And part of the money, 25%,
we borrowed for
capacity building. Yes. It's called Kenya Devolution Support Program from the World Bank. The government, national government, is keeping 20% of that borrowing. We have asked the question, which has not been answered. Why do we need to borrow to do capacity building of county governments when they are already doing it?
Yes.
Those are the things that this the nation must confront. That when we are doing the borrowing, and the people who have let us down, and I must admit, is the National Assembly, because these borrowings and their conditions are going to the National Assembly for approval. Whether external or internal, the National Assembly is approving. There should be disclosure. Means that if we have borrowed X for the Standard Gauge Railway, how are we going to repay it?
Yes.
Seated here as a legislator in this country, I cannot tell you that I know how it will be repaid, the conditions for such borrowing, and all these things. So therefore, while the President admits that that the question of national debt is an issue, it is an issue that will come in future. What bothers me the most about it is that the national debt is sitting heavily and will sit heavily on devolution. Why? Because when we do something called the division of revenue, the first thing we consider before we share revenue to the counties is national debt.
Yes.
So it's weighing on us very heavily.
Is it part of recurrent expenditure?
It is, because the repayment
you have to pay back.
You have to pay back. So you have to consider it before you share
revenue. So the 15% that goes to counties is after you do away with the recurrent expenditure.
Exactly.
So what is left, 15% goes to
exactly.
Yes.
That is the problem.
And before we come to Bwana Karanja Kabage, I want to get Senator Wamatangi's take on this, because we have it listed there, 1.2 billion from the government of Italy, another 1.2 from the European Investment Bank, 1.9 billion Belgian, 2 billion from the ADB, French government, Exim Bank, China, Japanese government, IDA, Afrexim, Standard Chartered, and we're just doing a quick calculation here, and it comes to about 138 billion shillings. I know you're in Jubilee, and you of course you're bound to defend the president. It should be worrying, even as a businessman.
I mean,
there's a level of borrowing that is a bit worrying.
Immediately when you say that, I know you're from Jubilee.
It should not be automatic.
I started becoming cautious.
I want you to be objective.
That you're not about to say that I'm from Jubilee, so I'm not supposed to reason.
No. I just don't want to be the president.
So I mean, I want to first be very clear as I answer that question in my mind, and also let you know, and Kenyans, that in the first place I'm a businessman, and so I can say a thing or two about borrowing. And let me first say that when the president was addressing this question, actually he was very clear. He said, I want to address this because there have been fears that the government is over-borrowing, and we run the risk of grinding into a halt or into a quagmire because of this borrowing. That's why he sought to explain. And let me say two things very quickly. One, you see, in the process of borrowing, there is the initiation of the process. You make a proposition, there is an evaluation, and the lender decides, determines on the basis of what you have said, are you good to be given that debt? Are you capable of repaying? So in the first place, we need to agree, because when this money is borrowed from either from the IMF or from wherever, the World Bank, any other countries, those countries first will do an evaluation of the proposal by the Kenyan government, and they are at liberty to make up their mind. Is it prudent? Because there's no country or any institution that's ready to put its billions of shillings in projects in the country where they can see that there is ultimately no possibility of paying. So the first thing,
really clear. Does the lender care if at all repayment?
Let me say.
And asking the question about Greece.
A minute. Listen. You see, there is no country, there is no institution that will willingly put its money where they know that they will not be able to get it back. So the process of evaluation first is there. That's the first hurdle. Secondly, I think if you listen to what the president said, is true to every business. And I want to ask you, Fred, even in the smallest of your own ventures, have you ever at any one time tried to fund anything you wanted to do that's new, either a small expansion or growth? There is only one way that you fund an expansion or growth. You borrow, or you can be able to do that from reserves that you have had. When you don't have reserves, you borrow. Now the basis that you have to borrow on is very simple, that you are clear that what you're investing in from that borrowing will bring in returns either in the short or long term. And this is the crux of this issue. The president explains this very well, that yes, it may seem like right now. And remember one thing, that we must be fair in our reasoning and in recommending. The reason why there seems to be overborrowing is because the first thing that the government did away with was internal borrowing. Because internal borrowing was putting our economy in a crisis by causing unmanageable inflation. So we went for external borrowing. Now, when this money is borrowed, and the president is saying we're investing it in energy projects, we are investing it in infrastructure, in roads, and he also goes a step further to say, please do not expect these returns or the effects of it to be felt tomorrow. It is long term. But if we have given a projected period of 10 years, within the 10th year, you will start to feel and reap the gains of this, because it is like the way we say in the idiom that you plant a tree that you may not enjoy its shade or live under its shade. So when some of these projects are undertaken, we must say clearly, and I say this very level-headedly because I'm a businessman, there are investments that I do myself that I know that the only people who are going to benefit from them is the general public who will be benefiting from it. Or maybe
what about borrowing for capacity building, as the Senator mentioned?
Let's put it this way. I think we need to have a perspective. Let's look at the historical perspective. Do you know Kenya is the only country in Africa that never has received debt relief? All these other countries you talk about, including Nigeria, they were given debt relief. Kenya has never been given debt relief.
We've never had any loan written off.
No, they don't write. They have not written.
There's a reason.
Okay? Kenya has continued to meet its obligations to lenders. That's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to tell you is, let's go back to post-World War II. Japan, Korea, Germany, all those countries, including a lot of countries in Europe, they were able to revive their economy through what they call Marshall Plan. The US government funded or loaned all these countries and they were able to develop. What am I saying? I'm saying our country as Kenya, one of the things that we must realize, if you want to develop a country, you have to develop a country from a certain vantage point. One of those vantage points is, you look at your budget and you ask yourself, internally, as you generate resources, how capable are you to prosecute your developmental agenda with your internal resources? And this is what my brother is talking about. In economics, we call it, if you allow government to borrow internally, it's called clouding effect. You have what is called clouding effect. Meaning, the majority of the other institutions, industries, manufacturers will not be able to access money from the local banks because the government will be the biggest buyer. Now, the alternative to that is to go international. And as you go international, you are borrowing on a proposal basis. There's a prospectus. That prospectus is studied by financial experts, economists, and they look at your country. Lenders are not so stupid. These people look at how are you going to sustain repayment.
But there have been cases where countries have been enabled, and the Senator mentioned Greece.
I am proud to be a Kenyan because I can say to you this.
Let me say.
Even Greece, the lenders who lent Greece.
Listen, I'll tell you, I'll even make a contrast between Greece and Kenya. Kenya, the borrowing that we are doing is intended to inventorize productive capacity of the future. Because this country is seriously under-provided for. I'll give you one side. Let me cite one example. Energy sector. Kenya, the total installed capacity is 2,600 megawatt. 2,300 megawatt. Our total demand is 1,650. Now, if you want to produce an economy, you are dead before you start moving. Because one of the key productive assets you need is energy. Make a contrast with Singapore, with Korea. Korea currently has got 90,000 megawatt installed capacity. Now, we talk about 2,300. Now, so when you talk about developing this country, and this is where I want to tell my brother here, the people who are opposed to even borrowing, to understand, unless they are insulated mentally, they don't understand the global and economic imperatives. Borrowing is a must. What is important is to provide oversight by Parliament to ensure that this money that is borrowed, is it going towards infrastructural development? But nobody should sit here and tell you that, oh, we are overborrowing, and I'm very disappointed.
In that case that he mentioned about capacity building at county level, is that something that we should be borrowing?
Just a minute. That's something that we can deal with. About
really? Why are you brushing it off?
Let me tell you, you're brushing it off.
No, I'm not brushing it off. I'm one of those people who believe, first of all, the way we installed or the way we set up our county government has a lot.
So you think it was necessary to borrow for that?
No. Well, whatever it is, but I'm trying to say this. And please, if you go to what is called Transitional to County Government Act, and these two very distinguished senators will tell you, if you read Section 7 of that act, clearly it laid out the roadmap as to how county government will function. County government will do what? You know what happened? Post 2013, the transitional authority was rendered useless. And therefore, most of these counties were left with the title. You are a county government of this, county government of this, but infrastructure-wise and institutional capacity was wanting.
Can I say something?
Yes,
you know, my good friend, you are skirting around the issue. This is called skirting. Let me explain. In these simple terms, borrowing is part of our law.
Yes.
Borrowing is part of the Constitution. Nobody says we should not borrow. And we have not gotten to a place where we have a balanced budget. We're not at that level yet. So, he knows, and this gentleman knows, there are two good businessmen, that even in their borrowing, you do what is called debt risk assessment. So, the question that we must ask ourselves, and Karanja Kabange cannot answer, and neither Kimani Wamatangi can answer that, is whether or not this country and the president has given us, his assurance is not good enough. I can tell you that. Because what is a debt risk assessment? I've just told you that the central bank governor, and to his credit, admitted to us in the Senate that we have gone overboard.
Yes.
You understand? These lending institutions, you asked that question, and Wamatangi started around the issue. These lending institutions, they never tell you that don't borrow. They tell you actually, borrow some more.
Yes.
That is the problem that ended up in Greece, that they ended up borrowing more to sustain what is called recurrent. Now, he will tell you as a businessman that in your assessment of things, when your wages goes above 30%, you're doing poorly.
Yes.
We had 50%. Your debt risk assessment will tell you that first of all, you're borrowing too much to do what is called consumption, consumption, which appears to be what we are doing to plug in our budget.
Yes.
Now, in terms of infrastructure, South Africa did this. It's not unusual to borrow for infrastructure development. In fact, some people, when you read some of the assessments about borrowings, particularly in Africa, and from China particularly, who are so willing to give us money, they are saying that we are borrowing, all these roads we are building and highways, they call them road to Shanghai, because they are giving us money and we are getting nothing out of it. When we used to borrow from other nations in the West, it wasn't like this. Now there's a concept which you do not know. Why? That's why we're not receiving something called concessional loans. Karanja Kabange knows that we have moved to something called a middle-level economy. When you're at a middle-level economy, you do not get concessional loans. The reason we have been able to pay, and he has not confessed, is because we have been borrowing money that we can repay. This government has borrowed 3 times more than all other governments.
Yes. Let me say this. Just a minute. I want to address just a very quick one. Let me address a very quick one. Of course, quickly. Yeah, very quickly. Yeah. You see, I just wanted to deal with the last point that he made.
Yes.
On the overborrowing, and I want you to. I don't want to make it technical, but I'll make it very simple. You see, the basic parameter, the balance that all the time you're doing borrowing, even if you went to borrow $1 trillion, is the echo effect of what you are doing. If you take the 1 trillion and where you're investing it, is there balance in the two? And I'll say this very simply. See, if we have borrowed 3 times more, on the other hand, it is evident that we are building roads 3 times more. That is why you find that there is evidence, for example, that the number of kilometers of roads tarmacked since independence equals to or is almost the same as the number of kilometers of road tarmacked
But
in 4 years. But listen to my point.
Economic growth.
Listen to my point. Now, this is what I'm saying. That's what I'm driving at.
Yes.
So, because you see, if you have a small shop, my friend Senator,
Yes.
and then you find all of a sudden that your research tells you that if you build a supermarket where you have a small shop, but you have to borrow 5 times you have the capacity and the possibility of having customers to buy at that level. Even if you borrow $1 trillion, that would be okay. But listen,
Gentlemen,
if you look at, for example, let me give a very quick example. Look at what is happening by opening up of the northeastern corridor, and for example the roads builder.
Yes.
If you look at the effect of the economy of that region,
Yes.
and comparatively to the national economy, now that you can have all those herders and pastoralists there put their cattle in a truck and have them in the other river within a day and sell them.
Because of time, because of time, we need to wrap up. So
and that's the issue.
Just have that in mind as we wrap up.
You can do things faster. You can generate money more faster, and it will pay even much more faster.
I think one of the things my brother Senator here is talking about scuttling around. Scuttling. What you could be scuttling,
not scuttling.
Scuttling. All right, because that's what they're doing.
Yes.
I have read a lot of comments by my fellow Kenyans. Let me put it that way, talking about we are over borrowing. But the only one thing they have not said is what is the alternative.
Yes.
There is no prescription as the alternative. Why? We have a population of about 45 million people.
Yes.
They are demanding services. And as they demand services, the country and history has shown we don't have those resources. And that's why we have to borrow and repay, put in infrastructure. For example, Marsabit, and it was even mentioned by the president.
Yes.
The people from Marsabit, they used to take 3 days. They are now taking hours to come to Nairobi because of that sort of thing. Now, a nation must open its frontiers, because this country has very serious developmental deficit.
Okay.
Now, because of that lack of development, and the people are demanding services, because you see, you cannot demand services and at the same time say, oh, I don't want the means of those services. Because the means of those services is that the country must be able to say, hey, wait a minute. Right now, we have to borrow today in order for us to be able to build the business. And my brother here knows, no country, no company that has ever generated resources on their own, except, and I say this with a lot of respect, those countries that are endowed with such natural resources like gas,
oil.
the oil,
Okay.
and even then they borrow. Let me tell you, they even borrow, because to put those infrastructures, to be able to generate, to be able to mine or generate those natural resources,
yes,
you have to be able to inventorize capacity for doing those things.
Gentlemen, I'll ask you last points briefly because our time is up.
My last point is this, that this gentleman sits in many boards and public companies where he's privileged to make decisions on behalf of shareholders. The shareholders of this country are Kenyans. Now, I have no issue about borrowing. I've said that before. It's part of our law.
Yes.
What I've simply said is that the president's assurance on borrowing is not good enough. The debt risk assessment should be a matter for Kenyans to study.
Yes.
So that just like he would do in a board meeting to allow his management to borrow and there's assessment be done, it is that assessment that the president should have published under this constitution, so that we the Kenyans who do not have the benefit of where the decision was made to get to understand. And lastly, to say that I would prefer that in future that every progressive state of the nation address goes back to what was said before, says we have taken step 1 and 2, we are going to 3 and 4, so that by the time a president finishes his 5 years, he can take the first and the last and say, I started here and this is where I am. And therefore, for me to go into another term, allow me to do 6, 7 and 8. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator.
Sure. Very quickly to say first on, we discussed a very important issue on the wage bill, and just to urge our country to move along with that urge by the president, and also recognize that reducing the wage bill does not only include that part of the legislators, also other employees within government, in the county governments, in the executive and so on. We have to look at that. And then secondly, you know, a very large part of this country, which has got huge potential, has hitherto been put aside or left behind. For example, all those places in northeastern where there's potential for growth, unexploited natural resources, people who would have done a lot of building of our economy because they had no power that time now, but now can be able to access power. Areas where children could not go to school and hence become citizens who are productive in those places because they could not access education then. If what it calls for now is for us to borrow so that we can get them to come back and join the rest of the country in building the nation and generating income and growing the economy, then that borrowing, if it is intended, and it has already been shown in demonstration, that now you can go to Marsabit, get those herders, bring their cattle to Nairobi and sell the same day and go back. You can get a child in Lokichogio to go to a classroom where there is electricity and they can become better citizens. That you can go to a hospital instead of having citizens dying in Turkana, they can go and get a C-section in their own hospital and get back to productive life. Yes. If that's what borrowing is all about, then it is good for this country.
Okay. Thank you, Senator. Yeah. Finally,
thank you very much. I think I wanted to say something about Greece in closing. Greece, its borrowing was at the level of 70 to 80% of its national budget. You get what I mean?
Yeah.
And then the problem is this. Because it's a mature economy, it did not have capacity to produce anymore. We have a huge retired people in that country. They love holidays. They do all sort of things. We had a major contrast between us and another country.
We had 50% of borrowing.
No, we are not at the 50%.
The president said 50.
No, well,
it's actually quoted as 55%.
Okay, he said it. Okay, fine, 55. But we are borrowing for what? Not for consumption. And that's the biggest distinction. Finally, let me put it this way. I think the president needs to be commended. Commended why? He is able to come forth and talk to his people and tell them in specific terms what is it I've done with whatever money we have borrowed.
That's his job.
In the majority of countries, that doesn't happen.
It's his job. It's in the constitution. It's not a favor.
Which is good.
We need to wrap up.
Which is good because he is being faithful
to the constitution,
to the tenets of his constitutional mandate. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bwana Karanja Kabagi, businessman and analyst. Senator Mutula Kilonzo, senator from Makueni, and Senator Kimani Wamatangi from Kiambu County, helping us look at the headlines this morning. Of course, today, ladies and gentlemen, we focused more on the State of the Nation address made yesterday by President Uhuru Kenyatta to Parliament, and this being his last State of the Nation address before the next general election. Now we head out to Ngong Hills, where Willis Waburu is ready to eat now, and later on we'll have another session of Power Startups with Joey Mudengi. From me, my name is Freddie Ndimuli. Good morning.